Few archaeological discoveries have impacted the modern world as much as the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, in a cave near the Qumran desert, a young Bedouin in search of a lost goat stumbled upon what would become one of the greatest spiritual enigmas in history. Inside ancient clay jars, carefully rolled parchments rested, preserved by time and millennia of silence. That once insignificant cave became a bridge between worlds separated by over 2 millennia. But among the nearly 1,000 texts found, there was one that raised more questions than answers, a manuscript that did not fit perfectly into the already known doctrines. A text considered too dangerous, too profound, and too enlightened to be shared with the world as it is. For decades, scholars have vied for access to the scrolls. The Vatican, European universities, and even government agencies have fought for control over their interpretation. Many documents were only translated decades after their discovery, and others have never been fully revealed. But why? What was in these fragments that caused so much discomfort in religious and political institutions? One of these scrolls, shrouded in controversy and denied by many, seemed to contain a type of wisdom that transcended the boundaries of dogma and entered the realms of direct experience of the sacred. A manuscript whose spiritual language was so pure and devoid of idolatry that it threatened to dismantle centuries of theological construction. This text, known among a few scholars as the manuscript of the inner master, was not simply a list of laws or mythological stories. It was a call to awakening. Its words spoke directly to the human heart, without intermediaries, without the need for temples or priests. It contained an urgent invitation to silence, to listen to the inner voice, and to commune with the divine through consciousness. It described practices of meditation, conscious fasting, connection with the primal sound, and the living presence of the inner light. Words that reminded not of the rigid rituals of an external cult, but the teachings of a man who walked along the shores of Galilee saying, "The kingdom of God is within you." This is where the mystery deepens, because the similarities between this manuscript and the messages attributed to Jesus of Nazareth are so many, so aligned in essence and practice, that they force us to rethink everything that has been taught about his life and mission. But how has such a significant document never been included in the Gospels? Why has its content been suppressed, discredited, silenced over time? What was so threatening about its powerful simplicity? The answer may lie in who wrote this text. The evidence points to a spiritual sect known as the Essenes, a community that lived on the fringes of Jewish society at the time, rejecting the corruption of the temple and dedicating themselves to spiritual purity and communion with the divine through direct practice. These men and women sought truth in silence, in retreats in the desert, in communion with nature and the principles of creation. And many believe that Jesus, before beginning his public ministry, spent years among them, learning, practicing, expanding his consciousness. The manuscript of the inner master seems to bear the fingerprints of this coexistence. Its words resonate with a depth that transcends moralism and points to a real, living transformation, accessible to all. It does not speak of blind faith, but of direct experience. It does not demand rituals, but invites presence. It does not impose dogmas, but reveals a path. And it is precisely for this reason that it was rejected by the structures that benefit from spiritual control. At the time of discovery, many scholars noted their discomfort with the content of this manuscript. While other texts were celebrated for confirming ancient traditions, this one was avoided, discussed in whispers, partially translated, and then archived in restricted access libraries. But even silenced, it persisted. Fragments emerged. Indirect quotations were cross-referenced with other apocryphal documents, and little by little, the silhouette of a greater truth began to emerge. A truth that invites us to look inward, not outward. This journey is not just about archaeology or historical curiosity. It's about recovering a forgotten piece of the most powerful message ever spoken. It's about reclaiming the golden thread that connects our essence to the source. The unknown Dead Sea Scroll is not just an ancient text. It's a spiritual mirror that invites us to remember who we are. A map to reuniting with the inner Christ, the living Logos, which is not in temples, but in the silence of our own being. As we delve into the content of this manuscript throughout this video, we will unveil passages that provoke, clarify, and transform. We will debunk myths, confront harsh truths, and offer a new perspective on the role of Jesus, not as an idol, but as a teacher of consciousness. Each part of this journey will reveal not only the secrets of the past, but the possibilities of the present. And in the end, what seemed distant and hidden may reveal itself as the key that has always been within the soul's reach. In this beginning, we are invited not just to listen to a story, but to partake in a revelation. The forgotten manuscript is no longer buried in the sands of time. It is here, alive, vibrant, waiting to be read with the eyes of the heart. And you are about to discover why this truth could not remain buried forever. Long before Jesus walked the streets of Nazareth or taught on the slopes of Galilee, there was a people living on the fringes of the Jewish world, following a path of spiritual purity, inner silence, and communion with the unseen forces of creation. These men and women did not seek fame, power, or influence. On the contrary, they deliberately withdrew from the corrupted society of their time to preserve something sacred, direct knowledge of the inner light, wisdom of the heart, and harmony with the cosmos. They were the Essenes, a brotherhood that, although ignored for centuries, hides in its history the keys that explain, complete, and even completely redirect our understanding of Christ's teachings. Traditional historical records say little about the Essenes. The texts of Flavius Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, and Pliny the Elder mention their existence as a Jewish sect living in the desert, practicing celibacy, sharing goods, and communal living. But the documents that truly reveal their essence were only discovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls. There, in the caves of Qumran, fragments came to light that speak of their spiritual practices, their purification rituals with water, their writings about the Master of Righteousness, and their beliefs about the spiritual world, the fate of the soul, and the role of man in the great cosmic web of creation. For the Essenes, spirituality was not a set of abstract beliefs, but a daily experience of elevation and alignment with the divine source. They understood the body as a temple, silence as prayer, and nature as a living reflection of heavenly wisdom. Unlike the Pharisees and Sadducees, dominated by political disputes and legalistic interpretations of the Torah, the Essenes sought direct communion with the divine through introspection, contemplation, and the conscious practice of goodness. It was a life of simplicity, not out of poverty, but by choice. They understood that the noise of the world prevented the awakening of the soul. This discreet, almost invisible way of life was sustained by an unusual spiritual rigor. The Essenes woke up before sunrise for practices of silent meditation and sacred chants. They observed astrology not as superstition, but as a symbolic language of the heavens. They nourished themselves purely, based on plants and grains, respecting life in all its forms. They practiced regular fasting and sought the purification of body and mind as a path to spiritual clarity. Many believed that these habits formed the foundation of Jesus' life before his public ministry, and that he would have been trained by these desert initiates during his youth. The connection between Jesus and the Essenes is not formalized by the canonical Gospels, but many apocryphal Gospels, as well as ancient traditions of Gnostic and Eastern Christianity, support this connection. There are indications that he may have lived in Qumran, studied ancient texts, and learned to access elevated states of consciousness through practices that the Essenes mastered. This is why his teachings sound so different from religious dogmas, because he spoke of lived truth, not repeated belief. He didn't bring a new cult, but a new perspective, a new consciousness, which was actually old, ancestral, hidden, but alive. In the texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are constant mentions of a Son of Light, a Master of Righteousness, and a future coming of an Anointed One who would bring light to the world and restore the lost connection between heaven and earth. This Master of Righteousness is described as someone who breaks with the corrupted system, teaches through parables, heals by laying on hands, and speaks of the truth that cannot be written. The parallels with the figure of Jesus are so profound that many modern scholars believe he was the manifestation of this prophecy, or at least, the one who understood its essence and fully embodied it. But why was this connection forgotten, omitted, erased from official history? The answer may lie in the threat it posed to the established power. If Jesus did not come to establish a religion, but to awaken consciousness, this weakens the structures that were built in his name. If he was an initiate among the Essenes and taught practices of direct connection with the divine, then the role of intermediaries, dogmas, and religious hierarchies loses its meaning. This is the truth that transforms, that liberates, and that scares. The Essenes believed in the existence of two worlds, the world of form and the world of light. The first is transient, imperfect, full of illusion. The second is eternal, pure, silent. To access the world of light, it was necessary to purify oneself, silence the ego, and listen to the inner voice. They spoke of the primordial sound that is in everything, the living word that dwells in the hearts of the righteous, and the divine presence that manifests in nature, in the harmony of the stars, in the silence of the mountains. These concepts, far from being too mystical, are incredibly similar to the words Jesus often repeated. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. The Essene brotherhood was secret out of necessity. They did not seek conversions or public preaching. Wisdom was transmitted through initiation, for instance, through practice. They understood that spiritual truth can only be revealed to those who are ready to receive it. Therefore, they spoke in symbols, parables, metaphors. And this is exactly what we find in the Gospels, a language full of spiritual keys, many of which are better understood in the light of the Essene teaching. For this reason, reading the manuscript of the Inner Master becomes so revealing. It unlocks these keys. When diving into the universe of the Essenes, we realize that Jesus did not emerge from nothing. He arose from a fertile field of ancient wisdom, practices refined over the centuries, from a spiritual lineage committed to the light. This does not diminish his greatness. On the contrary, it makes his mission even deeper. He was not a solitary revolutionary, but the apex of a hidden process of awakening that had been cultivated with patience and zeal in the desert. Understanding the Essenes is essential to understanding Jesus. It's like knowing the roots of a tree before appreciating its fruits. And most importantly, by reclaiming this legacy, we are not just unveiling a lost chapter in history, we are recovering spiritual tools that can still be applied today. The life of the Essenes is an invitation to conscious simplicity, to listening to the silence, and to practicing the light. And perhaps deep down, this is what Jesus wanted to teach us all along. For centuries, what the world knew as the Gospel was a selection of carefully chosen, edited, and approved texts by religious authorities that shaped the foundations of Christian faith. But what few know, and many avoid discussing, is that the formation of the Bible as we know it was marked as much by politics as by spirituality. And in this selective process, powerful voices were silenced. Among them, the manuscript known by few as the Book of the Inner Master, a text among the Dead Sea Scrolls that was never considered for inclusion in the official scriptures. Not because it lacked the essence of the divine, but because its light was too free, too direct, without filters or hierarchies. A text that, if it had been accepted, could have completely transformed Christianity from its very beginnings. The content of this manuscript goes far beyond any mythical narrative or formal religious instruction. It does not speak of ceremonial laws, genealogies, or spectacular miracles. It touches on something infinitely deeper, the reconnection of the human being with their divine nature. There is no imposition of beliefs or threats of condemnation in it. On the contrary, there are subtle guidelines about the inner path, about the silence that reveals, about the light that guides from within, and about the true communion with the Father of Truth, as he names the creative source of all existence. This type of language did not fit into the framework of an empire that needed control and dogma. Therefore, the manuscript was rejected, excluded, and in many circles, forbidden. Among its most impactful passages, we find teachings about the silent word, a concept that refers to the creative power not of external speech, but of inner vibration. The text invites the reader to silence the world of men in order to hear the breath of the eternal within oneself. It talks about the body as a passage temple, and the soul as a chalice of light. These concepts, while they may seem mystical today, were presented in a clear, practical, almost therapeutic way. It did not speak to the intellect, but to the inner self. That's why scholars who had access to it report a sense of presence and recognition when reading it, as if something that had always been forgotten was, at last, remembered. Many of the terms used in this manuscript, such as the watchful eye of the heart, the trail of the seven silences, the inner bread, and the breathing light, do not have parallels in the canonical texts, but clearly reflect a sophisticated and deeply symbolic spiritual system. And interestingly, several of these expressions appear fragmented in the apocryphal Gospels, especially in the Gnostic texts such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, suggesting a common origin of wisdom, a lineage of knowledge silently preserved outside of ecclesiastical power circles. The problem for religious leaders of antiquity was not just the content of the manuscript, but its implication. If humans could directly access divine truth, if the kingdom of God was an internal and present reality, then the role of priests, institutions, and rituals would crumble. The teaching there did not depend on external interpretations. It only required willingness, listening, and transformation. It was, by nature, uncontrollable. And everything that cannot be controlled tends to be rejected by those who seek to keep power structures intact. During the first centuries of Christianity, the diversity of interpretations and texts was vast. There were entire communities that had never heard of the Gospels that we now consider official. They based their faith on other documents, letters, and oral teachings that circulated freely, many of them aligned with the spirit of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These communities valued self-knowledge, equality between men and women, the simplicity of life, and the pursuit of the inner Christ. It is no coincidence that these same communities were persecuted, silenced, and in many cases, exterminated. The Council of Nicea in 325 AD marked the standardization of the Christian faith under the authority of the Roman Empire. There, texts were chosen and others discarded. Doctrines were officialized and disagreements eliminated. It was in this process that the manuscript of the Inner Master, even if it had survived in the Essene and Gnostic circles, was definitively erased from the official theological map. Its message was not compatible with an imperial Christianity, and even today, its absence screams among the pages of the Bible. But the echoes of its wisdom have not been completely extinguished. Throughout history, mystics, poets, and silent seekers have accessed fragments of this truth in their meditations, visions, and transcendental experiences. Many of these accounts, even without knowing of the manuscript's existence, describe the same images, the same principles, and the same invitations to introspection. This suggests that the truth contained therein is universal, predating writing, and greater than any religion. It's impossible to read this manuscript, even in the reconstructed and translated sections, without feeling a profound calling. It doesn't seek to convince, it doesn't want followers, it doesn't create divisions. It simply points inward, towards a quiet, luminous, and full space that inhabits all human beings. By recovering its message, we reclaim a forgotten dimension of Christ's journey, one that wasn't looking to form a new faith, but to awaken a new consciousness. Today, as religions fragment, people seek answers amidst chaos, and spirituality becomes, for many, just another commodity. This manuscript emerges as an ancient beacon that illuminates a simple and powerful path, that of self-reconnection. In it, Jesus is not seen as an object of worship, but as a living example of what can be achieved. He is not the end of the journey, but the bridge. The Silenced Dead Sea manuscript reminds us that the truth cannot be erased, only dormant. And when it awakens, as it does now, no power can stop it. Because it doesn't come from outside, but from within. And once it is recognized, it transforms everything. Not with violence, but with light. If there is something that profoundly distinguishes the forgotten Dead Sea manuscript from traditional religious texts, it is its enigmatic, non-dogmatic language and its total focus on three fundamentals that run through the entire document like invisible golden threads: light, sound, and silence. These are not just symbolic elements, but living spiritual principles, essential forces of creation that, according to the ancient Essenes, sustain the entire universe and guide the soul to the full realization of its divine nature. The absence of these pillars in most modern Western religious traditions is not accidental. It is the result of a systematic erasure of a knowledge that liberates rather than imprisons, that awakens rather than subdues. The light, according to the manuscript, is not merely physical, nor is it metaphorical. It is the first emanation of the eternal, the visible manifestation of the invisible, the witness of the uncreated, as it is called in its oldest verses. It is present everywhere, in the shine of loving eyes, in the dawn that silences thought, in the flash of intuition that breaks mental chaos. The manuscript teaches that the light is the true nourishment of the soul, and that every human being carries an inner lamp, a living spark that, when recognized and cultivated, illuminates the entire being. "The light in you knows the light above," says one of the passages, "and when both become one, there is no more death, but only return." The sound, which the text refers to as the breath of the Father, is described as the original vibration that initiated creation. It is not the mechanical sound, but the primordial sound, inaudible to common ears, that can only be felt when the heart aligns with truth. This sound is the living word, the silent song of heaven, and each being possesses a unique note within this cosmic symphony. The manuscript guides specific practices of intonation, breathing, and internal listening as means to tune in with this sound. The goal is not to sing outwardly, but to vibrate inwardly. It is at this point that it approaches Eastern traditions, such as the mantra in Hinduism or the Om in Buddhism, revealing an ancestral bridge between distant spiritual paths. But it is in silence that the manuscript dives deeper. For it, silence is not the absence of sound, but the fullness of presence. It is the original state of being, the language of the source, the space where sound and light merge into unity. In silence, the soul remembers, the text asserts, and in remembering, it awakens. It is in silence that all illusions dissolve, that the ego loses strength, and that the divine spark within us can, finally, be recognized without noise. The manuscript teaches that silence must be cultivated daily, not only as an external practice, but as an internal state, a constant listening to the invisible, a surrender to that which cannot be said, but can be felt with every cell of the body and every beat of the heart. These three pillars, light, sound, and silence, form a living, interdependent triad that guides the aspirant along the path of spiritual transformation. Light reveals, sound vibrates, silence integrates, and this Trinity movement is presented in the manuscript as the essence of Christ's true teachings, long before his name was canonized and his message institutionalized. The connection with Jesus here is not merely theoretical or symbolic. In various passages, there are mentions of the Son of Light who teaches with a voice that does not hurt and walks with eyes that do not judge. His presence is described as translucent, his word as music, and his silence as peace. It's impossible to ignore the parallelism with phrases attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. "You are the light of the world. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. The kingdom of God is within you," among so many others that, from the perspective of this manuscript, gain new depth. These were not just ethical teachings, but vibrational keys to expanded states of consciousness. The light he mentioned was not just a metaphor for goodness, but a state of perception. The sound he evoked was not speech, but frequency, and the silence that surrounded him was not emptiness, but the living presence of the source. In the manuscript, there are accounts of practices that seem to have been used to induce states of spiritual expansion. Among them is the rite of dawn, in which the initiates, before sunrise, would head to the top of the hills in Qumran, where they would stand in absolute silence, facing east, waiting for the first rays of light to touch their faces. At this moment, they would mentally chant sacred words, breathing deeply until a sense of profound unity with everything enveloped them. This rite, although simple, was considered one of the most powerful paths to connect with the divine, and it was said that those who practiced it with purity were capable of seeing with eyes of fire and hearing the heart of heaven. The absence of these teachings in later Christian tradition was not an accidental error. It was strategic. A teaching centered on inner light, primordial sound, and transformative silence negates the need for mediators. And in a religion organized as a power system, this is unacceptable. By silencing these pillars, institutions ensured the spiritual dependency of the masses. External rituals were created, words were memorized, repetitive prayers, all in substitution for the direct experience with the sacred. The result? A Christianity emptied of practice and saturated with theory, where many believe, but few awaken. However, the echoes of these pillars never completely disappeared. Great mystics, such as Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and so many others, touched upon these same truths in their profound experiences of contemplation. Even persecuted and censored, they left clues, fragments of light, vibrations of sound, traces of silence, so that future generations could rediscover the lost path. And today, as we recover the forgotten manuscript, these clues come together, forming a clear and powerful map for inner transformation. The wisdom of the manuscript invites us to stop, listen, and feel. To step away from the excess of words and dive into the space where there are no questions or answers, but only presence. It reminds us that the true miracle is not outside of us, but in the ability to perceive, resonate, and be silent in unison with the universe. Light, sound, and silence, the three forgotten pillars, are not ideas. They are realities. And to access them is to recover what should never have been lost, the living consciousness of the divine that resides in every human being. Throughout the history of institutionalized Christianity, the phrase, "the kingdom of God," has been progressively shifted from its spiritual origin to a distant, unattainable future promise, something that could only be obtained after death, through correct belief and religious submission. However, when we analyze the hidden manuscript of the Essenes and the original teachings attributed to Jesus with eyes free from dogmas, a radical truth emerges. The kingdom of God is not somewhere in the sky, nor is it a future city descending from the clouds. It is here, now, within each human being, merely waiting to be recognized. This simple, yet profound revelation resounds insistently in the forgotten texts of the Dead Sea and dismantles centuries of misinterpretation. What was hidden was not just a spiritual concept, but a key to inner freedom. In the silenced manuscript, the kingdom is described as the dwelling of the living light and the hidden field where the word germinates in silence. There is no mention of temples, priests, castes, or intermediaries. On the contrary, the text insists that every human being, even the simplest, carries within them a hidden path of return, a golden thread that connects their soul to the source. This path does not depend on religious codes or external impositions, but on the awakening of inner perception. He who ceases to seek outside and listens to the subtle voice in the heart, says a fragment, already inhabits the kingdom, even though men say he lives among the dead. This vision changes absolutely everything. What was once passive waiting becomes an active practice of self-knowledge and spiritual integration. It is at this point that the message of Jesus, when understood in the light of this manuscript, reveals its true transformative nature. When he said, "The kingdom of God is within you," it was not a metaphor, nor a riddle. It was a direct and clear invitation to a journey of introspection. It was the revelation that God is not an external figure controlling the universe with a throne and judgment, but a living and silent presence, pulsating within each being. This teaching, however, was not of interest to the powers of the time. A people who recognize their internal divinity are a free people, and spiritual freedom has always been a risk for empires. The manuscript describes the process of entering the kingdom as a sequence of inner openings. The first is silence, which breaks the ties of mental noise. The second is listening, which refines perception and broadens the heart. The third is surrender, which dissolves the ego and allows fusion with the source. And finally, vision, not sight with the physical eyes, but the ability to see reality as it is, beyond the illusions of the mind. This path is accessible, but it requires courage, as the greatest obstacle is not the external world, but one's own internal conditioning. The manuscript is clear. No one enters the kingdom who has not ceased to fight against the light. This approach invites us to a fundamental question. If the kingdom is within, why do we create external structures to reach it? Why do we build cathedrals, temples, priestly castes, dogmas, and liturgies, when all that is needed is to turn inward? The answer lies in fear. The ego fears silence, fears the inner light, fears the dissolution of its masks. And religions, for the most part, have become mirrors of the collective ego, offering security, control, and identity, but not necessarily truth. The Essene manuscript breaks with all this, offering a radically simple path, and therefore, profoundly powerful. The canonical Gospels contain traces of this teaching, but diluted. Jesus' parables are metaphors for the inner kingdom, the mustard seed that grows in silence, the yeast that transforms the dough, the hidden treasure in the field, the pearl of great value. All speak of an internal discovery, an invisible process that occurs in the awakened heart. However, when interpreted literally or as moral allegories, these stories lose their potency. The manuscript, on the contrary, speaks openly. There is no coded language. There is direct, almost meditative instruction. It leads, verse by verse, the reader into a deep immersion within themselves, until the external world becomes only a reflection and no longer a cause. In one of the most moving passages of the manuscript, the author writes, "The kingdom is like the space between thoughts, like the moment before sound, like the glow that precedes vision. It is not made of things, but of presence. Whoever finds it never seeks again." This kind of perception cannot be taught by words alone. It must be experienced. And that's exactly what the text proposes. Not intellectual knowledge, but knowledge through direct revelation, a knowing that is not acquired, but remembered. It is at this point that Christ's teaching draws near, almost merges, with the path of great mystics from all traditions. There is a convergence between this manuscript and the teachings of Lao Tzu, Buddha, Rumi, Plotinus, and others who also spoke of an inner kingdom, a state of elevated, silent, full being that does not depend on external circumstances. The major difference is that while these Eastern traditions maintained their contemplative root, Western Christianity has almost completely deviated from this axis, prioritizing belief, future salvation, and fixed dogmas at the expense of the direct experience of the sacred. Recovering the vision of the kingdom as an internal state is not just a historical or spiritual exercise. It's an existential revolution. It means giving up the relentless pursuit of external validation, ceasing the pilgrimage for idols and intermediaries, and turning with humility and courage inward. The lost manuscript gives us the tools for this. It provides practical instructions, symbolic maps, guidance for silence, for mindfulness, for listening to the inner word. It points the way, but does not force. It lights the lamp, but lets each one choose to walk. Upon understanding the kingdom of God as an inner state, the entire narrative of salvation is transformed. Salvation is not about being accepted by an external deity, but remembering who you truly are. Salvation is to stop living in the illusion of separation and return to unity with the source. The Christ of the manuscript did not come to found a new religion, but to tear the veil of illusion. He did not ask for worship, but transformation. He did not want followers, but the awakened. And this may be the most revolutionary message of all. This kingdom, so often promised as the future, is already among us. It is in the silence between two breaths. It is in the moment when fear is abandoned. It is in the light that shines behind the eyes when the mind is quiet. The forgotten manuscript brings no news. It brings memories. It does not impose truths. It reveals paths. And the one who reads it with an open heart will realize that it is not an ancient text being rediscovered, but oneself. Few moments in the history of Western spirituality are as decisive, and at the same time so laden with silence, as the councils that determined the course of nascent Christianity. Especially the Council of Nicea, held in 325 AD, under the command of the Roman Emperor Constantine. What was at stake at that moment was not just the organization of a faith, but the foundation of a power system. a spiritual architecture that would be used to control hearts and minds for centuries. What many still don't know is that during these councils, texts were accepted and others rejected, not based on their intrinsic spiritual value, but on their usefulness for maintaining imperial authority. And it was in this process that the unknown manuscript of the Dead Sea, along with so many other living writings, was deliberately silenced. The Council of Nicea was not a pure meeting in search of truth. It was a political and theological assembly convened to resolve internal disputes and consolidate Christianity as the official religion of the empire. The figure of Jesus needed to be defined, stabilized, institutionalized. The variety of interpretations about his nature, his teachings, and his role in creation caused discomfort to the Roman authority. It was necessary to unify, and to unify, it was necessary to simplify, erase, shape. The multiplicity of gospels, epistles, poems, visions, and writings like those of the inner master threatened the cohesion of the dogma. Not because they were false or inaccurate, but because they offered paths to the freedom of the soul, and not to its submission. In the Essene manuscript, Jesus appears not as the only Son of God, but as an enlightened master, a supreme example of someone who had achieved total communion with the divine. This view was absolutely incompatible with the faith model that the councils wanted to construct. After all, if we are all potentially bearers of the same light, then no one can be placed on an exclusive pedestal. Salvation, in this case, is not a divine concession to those who believe, but an inner achievement of those who awaken. And this is a risk for any system that aims to position itself as a mediator between man and God. The manuscript therefore needed to disappear from the narrative. It wasn't just a textual erasure, it was a reorganization of collective consciousness. Entire libraries were burned, spiritual communities were persecuted, monks were silenced, and at the same time the words of Jesus were reinterpreted, often distorted, to uphold a rigid and authoritarian doctrine. The kingdom of God is within you became a promise for the future. The love one another was eclipsed by the idea of original sin, and the idea that inner light is accessible to all was replaced by the worship of an external, distant, unreachable Christ, transformed into an object of adoration rather than an example of accomplishment. The councils officially defined which gospels were legitimate. Of the many that circulated in the early Christian communities, only 4 were accepted: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Writings such as the Gospel of Thomas, that of Mary Magdalene, that of Philip, that of James, all deeply connected to inner spirituality, were labeled as heretical. These texts, which carried teachings that directly echoed the messages from the Dead Sea Scrolls, were literally buried in the desert or in caves as a form of protection against destruction. Many of them only resurfaced in the 20th century, proving that the history of Christian spirituality is much larger than the official books tell. What happened was the replacement of a religion of consciousness with a religion of obedience, a faith that once encouraged self-knowledge and the experience of the divine within oneself began to demand submission, blind belief, fear of hell, and hope for paradise. The masters became idols, the symbols turned into dogmas, and the living teaching of transformation was converted into moralism and control. This was not an accidental deviation, it was a conscious strategy, and the documents that threatened this structure needed to be eliminated. The silenced manuscript presents a path that is essentially incompatible with any structure based on spiritual intermediation. It does not speak of confession, penance, or ecclesiastical authority. It teaches that access to truth is direct, that each human being has within them the eye of light, the spark that guides beyond illusion. It does not offer ready-made answers, but tools for deep listening. And it is precisely for this reason that it was left out. Because an awakened soul does not need to be controlled, it is free. And spiritual freedom has always been seen as a threat to those who live off the domination of others' faith. Many modern theologians, when studying the non-canonical documents, are perplexed by the depth of these texts. They are works of rare beauty, filled with symbolic images, practical guidelines, and mystical experiences. They speak of unconditional love, of union with the divine, of overcoming the ego, of spiritual equality among all beings. And when compared with the texts selected by the councils, it's impossible not to notice the difference in tone and purpose. The voice of the manuscript is serene, profound, liberating. The voice of the dogmas that suppressed it is rigid, exclusive, vertical. And this difference is not merely literary, it is a difference in consciousness. The silencing of the manuscript is also linked to the attempt to break the spiritual lineage of the Essenes. These initiates, guardians of ancient knowledge, were labeled as fanatics or marginalized as a sect, but their legacy is immense. They preserved practices of purification, silent prayer, communion with the elements of nature, astrological and symbolic studies, and energy and vibrational healing. They were true scientists of the spirit, and the text that came from them, transmitted through time and rediscovered in Qumran, represents a spiritual heritage that can no longer be denied. This conspiracy was not only against texts, but against the awakening of humanity. By eliminating the manuscript and other similar texts, the councils deprived us of a mystical, profound, liberating Christianity. Instead, they offered us a limited, moralistic, and fearful version, a system that imposes rather than inspires, that demands rather than reveals. And yet, the truth remained, silent, hidden, but present, like the ember under the ashes, waiting for the breath of consciousness. Today, as we rediscover this manuscript, we not only correct a historical injustice, but we reconnect with a level of teaching that is absolutely current, necessary, and transformative. It reminds us that the true Christ is not on the stone altars, but on the living altar of the heart, that his message is not a monopoly of any institution, but a heritage of the human soul, and that spirituality is not submission, but freedom. The truth may have been hidden, but never destroyed. It resurfaces now, stronger than ever. What separates an ordinary text from a true spiritual teaching is not the eloquence of its words, nor its antiquity or sacred appearance, but the level of consciousness it awakens in the reader. And in this regard, the hidden manuscript of the Essenes transcends any known category. It does not merely inform, convince, or indoctrinate, it transforms. With each verse, there is not just instruction, but a hidden vibration that acts directly on the reader's soul, as if each word were a living particle of light, a spiritual code, a fragment of eternity that is activated not by literal reading, but by internal tuning with the silent truth that already resides within each human being. These codes are not explicit teachings, nor are they magical formulas. They are symbolic and vibrational structures that carry meanings on multiple levels. The text works in layers, one for the mind, another for the heart, and another for the spirit. It speaks to the conscious, but communicates directly with the deep unconscious, where ancestral memories of forgotten wisdom sleep. And that's why many who read translated excerpts from this manuscript report inexplicable sensations, as if something were touched without being named, as if memories from other lives were activated, as if the soul itself were pulled from the hypnotic sleep of material reality. One of these codes appears repeatedly in the manuscript, the inner eye. But this is not a psychological metaphor. It's about a real spiritual function, the non-physical vision, which allows to see the truth behind appearances. The text says, "The eye that sees the invisible is the same that was given at the beginning of creation. It does not close over time, but falls asleep when man looks too much at the world of forms." This is a key. The awakening of spiritual vision does not occur by belief, but by emptying. The less we identify with the visible, the more we access the invisible. And this principle is spread in other mystical traditions, from the third eye of the East to the eyes of fire described in the prophetic visions of the Old Testament. Another recurring code is the idea of the living word. The manuscript does not speak of the written or spoken word as intellectual expression, but of the primordial creative sound, a kind of silent vibration that sustains the universe. It asserts that this word cannot be pronounced with the mouth, but can be heard with the heart. Whoever hears the word within themselves never gets lost among the noises of the world, declares one of its passages. This conception is deeply aligned with the Gnostic concept of the Logos, the divine principle of intelligence and order that vibrates in everything. Furthermore, It connects with the Vedic tradition of the primordial sound, Om, as if the ancient wisdoms of the world shared the same essential root, the divine vibration as the structure of reality. There are also numeric and geometric codes hidden in the text. Some passages use patterns of 7 repetitions, a traditional symbol of spiritual perfection and cyclical totality, 7 stages of purification, 7 breaths of light, 7 hidden names of the eternal. It's not a coincidence. It's coded language. These numbers, when analyzed by scholars of Kabbalah and sacred geometry, reveal structures that point to an integrated understanding of the universe, cycles, rhythms, shapes that repeat in spirals, indicating that everything, from the atom to the cosmos, follows the same invisible dance. The manuscript, therefore, not only conveys messages, it reflects the very pattern of creation. Another powerful symbol used in the writings is the invisible chalice. It appears as an image of the purified soul, the inner vessel capable of containing the light of the divine. The soul that empties itself becomes a chalice, and the chalice that receives the light overflows without losing itself. This idea echoes the teachings of humility and surrender that Christ would have conveyed, but with an almost alchemical depth. The chalice is not something to be filled from the outside, but something to be prepared from within. This symbol is similar to the Grail of Arthurian traditions, another sacred chalice lost, sought after, but that can only be found by those who first find themselves. The language of the manuscript is almost always poetic, but behind its aesthetic beauty lies vibrational precision. The choice of words, the order of the verses, the harmony among the divine names mentioned, everything points to an applied spiritual science. This text was not written to be merely read, but to be meditated upon, internalized, contemplated. It is, in practice, an activation tool. And for that reason, it cannot be fully translated into modern languages without losing something essential. Its strength lies between the lines, in what vibrates beyond words, in what is felt, not said. Moreover, there is evidence that the Essenes themselves used this manuscript as part of an initiatory process. It was not handed out to just anyone, but only to those who had already undergone certain purification and silence rituals. The text was studied slowly, in cycles, with long periods of contemplation between one passage and another. The goal was not to accumulate knowledge, but to become the teaching itself. As one of its lines says, "He who understands with the mind is a disciple. He who understands with the being is a son of light." This distinction is crucial. The manuscript does not seek to create scholars, but to awaken individuals. Among the most impactful fragments of the document is the so-called verse of memory, which says, "Remember yourself before the name, before the form, before time. For there dwells what was never born and will never die." This kind of statement does not fit into conventional theologies, but it is a direct window to spiritual realization. It invites us back to the original state of being, to the deep memory of unity, to the contact with what we are beyond identity, beyond personal history, beyond the body. And this is perhaps the most powerful of the manuscript's keys. It does not offer paths to find something new, but to remember what has always been present, even if forgotten. The presence of codes in the manuscript also explains why it was so feared, because encoded texts activate uncontrollable states. They not only inform, they transform. They don't teach what to think, but they collapse fixed mental structures. They don't create followers, but awaken inner leaders. For this reason, texts like this could not be included in a religious structure based on authority and hierarchy. They don't fit into closed rituals. They are seeds of freedom, and every seed of freedom is, to power, a threat. Today, in the light of new discoveries and a humanity in search of deeper meaning, these codes are starting to be rediscovered, not as elitist mysteries, but as living keys that belong to everyone. They were hidden, not to be denied, but to wait for the right moment to awaken. And that moment is now. The language of the soul is becoming audible again, and those who are willing to listen, with courage and an open heart, will start to realize that the true teaching of Christ, that of the inner kingdom and the living light, was never lost. It was coded, waiting for eyes that could see and ears that could hear. Among the many mysteries surrounding the life of Jesus, perhaps none is as carefully omitted as his possible connection to the Essenes. Historical documents, ancient oral traditions, and archaeological evidence, especially those found in the caves of Qumran, suggest a much deeper relationship between the Master of Nazareth and this spiritual desert community than the canonical Gospels reveal. The idea that Jesus may have lived among the Essenes, learned from them, practiced their rites, and even received initiations within their tradition is as powerful as it is dangerous to the institutional narrative. Dangerous because it deconstructs the myth of an isolated Jesus, miraculously appearing with innate divine wisdom, and reveals something even more extraordinary, that he followed a human, disciplined, conscious path towards awakening, guided by a silent lineage of masters of light. The Essenes were not just desert ascetics, they were a spiritual school of the highest level. Their knowledge was preserved with extreme zeal, transmitted through initiatory rites, symbolic codes, and rigorous practices for the purification of the body, mind, and soul. They lived in retreats, in communion with nature, respecting cosmic cycles and the principles of universal balance. Their texts spoke of the soul as an immortal flame, the body as a living temple, and the earth as a mirror of heaven. The similarity between these principles and the teachings of Jesus is so striking that, as we delve into the fragments of the hidden manuscript and historical records, the connection becomes practically inevitable. Not as a romantic hypothesis, but as a truth hidden in plain sight. The official Gospels are strangely silent about Jesus' youth years. Between his 12th and 30th years, there are virtually no records. This gap of nearly 2 decades is one of the largest narrative voids in Western religious history. However, various ancient manuscripts and Eastern traditions suggest that this period was intensely dedicated to spiritual preparation. Apocryphal texts, such as the Gospel of the 12 Saints, the Gospel of Peace, and even Tibetan and Hindu records, point to silent journeys and learning. But among all possibilities, the most solid is Jesus' coexistence with the Essenes, not just as a visitor, but as an initiate, an apprentice who, alongside the desert sages, learned the art of deep meditation, the science of silence, the rites of consecration to light, the mastery over the forces of nature, and, above all, the revelation of the inner Christ. The Dead Sea manuscript, although it never explicitly mentions the name of Jesus, accurately describes the coming of an enlightened master referred to as the Son of Light, or Anointed of Silence. This master would be recognized not for his outward deeds, but for his inner purity, for his ability to see beyond forms and to speak with healing truth. He would come not to establish a new faith, but to rekindle the ancient flame of forgotten wisdom. His words would be like mirrors, and his presence like a lamp. It's hard to ignore the resemblance to the figure of Jesus. Even more so, the principles of the manuscript, the inner kingdom, communion with the Word, the practice of sacred silence, compassionate service, are the same as he would have manifested in his public life. The relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist also reinforces this connection. John was the son of a priest, but he broke away from the temple system, living as a hermit and preaching in the desert. His practices of purification with water, his symbolic language, and his radical ethical stance are typical of the Essene tradition. He was preparing the way for someone greater, and that someone, according to the Gospels, was Jesus. But what the official texts do not mention is that, most likely, Jesus was already part of the same spiritual lineage as John. Both were fruits of the same tree, the silent tree of the desert initiates, who preferred inner light to outer glory, silence to noise, service to domination. Various fragments of the manuscript describe the Anointed One as someone who heals with words without violence, touches with hands without demanding, and remains silent when the world screams. He teaches that true power lies in gentleness, that the strongest is the one who masters himself, and that presence is more healing than any ritual. These attributes are mirrored in the Gospels. The Jesus who forgives without condemning, who retreats to pray alone, who remains silent in the face of violence, who speaks in parables to those who have ears to hear. The congruence between the manuscript and the Gospels, when read with attentive eyes, is impressive. But while the institutionalized Gospel places Jesus as a unique and distant figure, the manuscript shows him as part of a path that everyone can tread. Another point that highlights this connection is the practice of communion with the elements. The Essenes viewed water, fire, air, and earth as living, conscious forces. Their daily prayers were directed to the angel of pure water, the angel of the Sun of Truth, the angel of the silent air. These entities were not worshipped, but recognized as expressions of the One. Jesus' teachings about baptism, about bread and wine as living symbols, about the wind that blows where it wills, and the light that shines in the darkness, are echoes of these practices. The spirituality he taught was not about denying the world, but about integration. And this integration is precisely at the heart of Essene wisdom, living as a bridge between heaven and earth, between spirit and matter, between silence and word. The denial of this connection by official history is not surprising. Acknowledging that Jesus came from an initiatory lineage would require admitting that his wisdom was cultivated, that he was not a magical exception, but a full expression of human potential. This would dismantle the myth of exclusivity and make room for every human being to see themselves as a potential Christ. The Church, fearing this decentralization of power, preferred mystery over the path, dogma over process. And so, the link with the Essenes was severed, the texts were buried, and the memory erased, but not forever. Today, with the recovery of the Qumran manuscripts and the rediscovery of apocryphal and Gnostic texts, this truth begins to emerge again, not as theory, but as experience. Many modern seekers, when practicing the same Essene principles, silence, conscious fasting, communion with nature, inner listening, have reported the same perceptions described in the manuscript. They see the light, hear the word, feel the kingdom. This is the greatest proof that Jesus' path was not exclusive, but exemplary. He did not come to be worshipped, but to be followed, not in the external sense, but internally, in the real transformation of consciousness. The bond between Jesus and the Essenes offers us a new spiritual map, a map where faith is not belief but experience, where God is not in books but in the living heart, where salvation is not escape but presence, and where each human being is a temple, a chalice, a fragment of eternal light. This map was hidden, it was concealed for centuries, but now it re-emerges, and with it, the possibility of a deeper, freer, truer spirituality. There is a type of truth that cannot simply be studied, discussed, or compared. It can only be lived. The forgotten manuscript of the Dead Sea falls precisely into this category. It is not just an ancient text, but a living revelation, capable of completely transforming the way we see life, spirituality, and ourselves. The knowledge contained within it was not meant to be confined to scholars in closed rooms or theologians with polished speeches. It is a direct and radical invitation to experience the inner light, liberation from the ego, and reconnection with the source of all that is. Reading this manuscript with an open heart is like lighting a torch in a tunnel that seemed eternal. Suddenly, what was darkness becomes a path. The transformation that this manuscript offers is not theoretical, it is experiential. It does not propose a new belief, but the abandonment of beliefs that obscure the truth. It does not teach obedience to dogmas, but to listen to the living voice of conscience. The silence, so emphasized in its lines, is not an end in itself, but a gateway to presence. By practicing what the text calls the world's rest, we come into contact with a deeper intelligence, which is not mental, but spiritual. This rest is the first step to hear what the manuscript calls the inner word, the original vibration that still pulses in every human being, even if muffled by emotional, social, and existential noises. Awakening does not happen in a spectacular way, as many imagine. It occurs in layers. It starts with small perceptions, a sudden peace in the midst of chaos, a moment of complete silence between two thoughts, a gaze at the sky that lasts longer than usual, a cry without an apparent cause in the face of a truth that suddenly recognizes itself. These are the signs that the manuscript has begun to fulfill its role, not to inform, but to activate. not to convince, but to remember. The soul, upon hearing certain words, recognizes something ancient, a wisdom that is not learned, but remembered. That's where the transformation begins. Applying the teachings of the manuscript in daily life means, first and foremost, breaking away from automaticity. It teaches us to slow down, to observe, to breathe mindfully, to regard others with compassion, to retreat not out of fear, but out of love for one's own presence. Practices such as morning silence, contemplating natural light, non-judgmental listening, and purifying one's diet are merely gateways to higher states of perception, small gestures that, when done with intention, realign the soul with what is eternal. Spirituality, in this context, ceases to be a part of life and becomes the axis of everything. The external world is not denied, it is reinterpreted. The text also teaches us that there is no evolution without purification, and this does not mean guilt or punishment, but the cleansing of everything that obscures the inner light. Unresolved emotions, repetitive thoughts, unnecessary attachments, desires that distract us, all of this needs to be gently and firmly dissolved. The manuscript speaks of the silent fire, which does not burn the body, but illuminates the shadow. This is an internal process, in which we gradually let go of the false self until the true self can emerge. This work, although challenging, is liberating, because the pain of letting go is infinitely smaller than the suffering of carrying what is no longer useful. The reunion with the inner kingdom, as described by the text, transforms our relationships. We start to see others not as obstacles or threats, but as reflections. Every interaction becomes a chance to see oneself, to heal wounds, to practice truth. Compassion ceases to be an abstract virtue and becomes a way of being in the world. Guilt is replaced by loving responsibility. Rigidity gives way to lightness, and spirituality, once confined to the temple or Sunday, invades everyday life. Work becomes practice, silence becomes prayer, the body becomes an altar, life, at last, becomes sacred. This transformation also affects our view of time and death. The manuscript asserts that those who see with the light from within know that time is a cloak and death merely a change of robe. This wisdom changes everything. Fear dissolves. Anxiety loses strength, presence expands, life ceases to be a race and becomes a dance, and even the pains, losses, and crises cease to be tragedies and become teachers. Everything takes on a new meaning when the light is recognized as the essence of existence itself. And this light, as the text insists, never goes out. It only hides behind the clouds of the ego. The manuscript also suggests that individual transformation is inseparable from collective transformation. The awakening of one being sends ripples around. Each soul that aligns with the silent truth contributes to the elevation of the whole. The world doesn't change by imposition or external revolution, but by vibrational contagion. It's like a bonfire lit in the middle of the night. It only takes one flame to ignite others. The text says, "The light in one is enough to spark 1,000. Therefore, personal practice, no matter how solitary it may seem, is always an act of service. To serve the light is to serve life." For many, this path may seem too subtle, too slow, too invisible. But that is exactly its beauty. It does not promise external miracles, but awakens the miracle of perception. It offers no guarantees, but reveals that true security lies in the unwavering trust of the awakened soul. There are no magic techniques, ready-made formulas, or intermediaries. There is only presence, listening, and surrender. And it is this simplicity that makes it so revolutionary, because everything the world has taught us leads us outward, and the manuscript, with tenderness and firmness, invites us to return inward. This return is not an escape, it's a return to the center, and from this center, everything changes. The mind becomes calm, the heart expands, intuition blossoms, life begins to flow with lightness and meaning. What was once a problem becomes an invitation. What was fear becomes a portal. What was doubt becomes silence. The manuscript is more than text, it's a mirror. And when we see ourselves in it, we don't just see what we are, but what we can be. Not an idealized being, but a real, awake, present being. A being that carries Christ within not as an external figure, but as a living essence. Not as an idol, but as a state of consciousness. So, we arrive at the deepest point, the realization that the light we seek was never absent. It has always been here, in the now, in the center of the chest, in conscious breath, in the silence between two thoughts. The manuscript brings no news. It returns us to the original truth. It shows us that the path of Christ is the path of presence, of listening, of humility, and of living love, and that each step taken on this path is, in itself, the greatest possible revolution. Because an awakened human being does not need to change the world, they are already the transformed world. Before you leave this video, I want to extend a very special invitation to you, Mind Unfettered. If this journey so far has ignited something within you, if any passage, word, or silence has touched your innermost self, comment below now. What do you believe has been hidden from us all this time? Respond with your heart. This comment section is not just a place for words, it's a field for conscious expression. When you share your vision, you ignite the spark in others as well. We are co-creating a vibrational field of remembrance and awakening. Let's manifest this truth together. And now that you understood what was hidden behind the lost manuscript, get ready to delve even deeper. Tap now on the next video that's on your screen, The Hidden Prophecy of the Three Veils, What Only the Truly Awakened Can See. In it, you will discover the three hidden layers of reality that have been veiled from humanity for millennia, and how only those with open spiritual eyes can traverse them. Click, take a deep breath, and follow the light that has already awakened within you.